Thank you all for joining us today for our third annual Ed Talk. Wow. And a very important conversation that we're going to have today. Brexting, binge watching, and beyond. How parent digital media use shapes early parenting and relationships. We are especially pleased to be joined by professionals from across early childhood, health, family support, education, advocacy sectors, individuals, and organizations committed to advancing outcomes for children and families during the most formative years of life. So, just sharing a little bit about First Five. At First Five, our mission is rooted in supporting the healthy development of young children and strengthening the families and systems that help them thrive. Child development is at the center of our work because what happens in the earliest years shapes cognitive growth, emotional well being, language development, and lifelong health. And increasingly, one of the environments shaping that development is the digital world. Screen time is often discussed in terms of how much media children consume. But what we are learning is that the broader digital ecosystem matters just as much. It is not only about a child's screen time, their screen use, but also about how technology influences caregiving moments, daily routines, responsiveness, and relationships. This is why this conversation is so important to our mission. It challenges us to consider how we equip families to navigate a digital landscape that is both unavoidable and rapidly evolving without framing the issue through a blame or oversimplification. Instead, it calls upon us to approach digital media as a modern determinant of family interaction and child development, one that deserves thoughtful, evidence-based attention. Today's webinar helps us do just that. Supporting healthy child development requires us to engage with realities families face today. That means recognizing digital media as a part of the caregiving ecosystem and ensuring our strategies, messaging, and interventions reflect that complexity. This is not about guilt. It's about awareness, intentionality, and creating environments where our children can flourish. And to guide us through this important discussion, we are honored to welcome an exceptional researcher, educator, and advocate in the field of early childhood health and development. It is my honor and my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alison K. Ventura, who is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Public Health at Cal Poly South San Luis Obispo. She serves as the director of the Cal Poly Healthy Kids Lab and Center for Health Research, and she also serves as a commissioner for First Five San Luis. I want to say Santa Barbara County. We want to. First Five San Luis Obispo County. Thank you, First Five SLO, for making this connection to us. For more than a decade, Dr. Ventura's work has focused on parent-childhood interactions, early feeding experiences, and the ways in which these moments shape lifelong health and development. Her research explores the dynamic relationship between parent behaviors and child outcomes, offering insights that directly inform programs, policies, and supports for families during the most critical years of life. She is also the author of Promoting Responsive Feeding During Breastfeeding, Bottle Feeding, and Introduction to Solids. And her work continues to bridge science with practical strategies that professionals and families can apply in everyday life. We are thrilled to learn from her expertise today. Please join me in welcoming. Thank you, Dr. Alison Ventura, for being with us today. Looking forward to your comments.
Thank you for that lovely introduction and welcome, Wendy. I'm so excited to be here. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the interest and excitement to learn about such an important topic for today's families who are trying to raise children in a modern world. So we'll think about the ways that families are using technology, and in particular, how parents are using them for their own self-regulation and emotion regulation, as well as with their children, and what we can do as family members and practitioners and supporters of families to try to help them navigate this modern world healthfully in a way that promotes healthy relationships and development for their children. So what we'll talk about today will kind of be binned into four different topics or focus areas. We'll first think about the importance of responsive parenting, what that means, what it looks like, and how we want parents to be responsive to their children to support healthy development. We'll then think about this idea of technoference or technological interference in early interactions in different contexts that are most prevalent and perhaps most impactful. We'll think about this idea of media emotion regulation, of how devices might be used as a tool in many ways to support families across many different domains, for better or worse. And then think about practical implications given what we know to date about technology use within families. So let's think about the importance of responsive parenting first. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little video that I think kind of illustrates um, the concept of responsive parenting and attunement really nicely. So while watching this short clip, I want you to look at these two buddies who are watching TV together and think about what you're noticing in the interaction and whether you think this interaction would be beneficial or detrimental in terms of the child in this interaction, their outcomes.
Go somewhere else then. Don't break here. You know what I'm saying? That's what I said. Indians like, you know what I'm saying? I was like, what in the world? Don't do it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. 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 You think a lot alike, huh?
Okay, that may have been one you've seen before. I know it's been around for a while, but um, one of the things I love about watching this interaction is just how connected dad and baby are, even though baby doesn't yet have the words to communicate to dad in the way that he's communicating to baby. There's still so much richness there in terms of the back and forth and the attention. And you may have noticed, I mean, they're watching TV together. The dad's got a phone sitting on his lap open, and yet he's really attending to his child and engaging with his child in the way that the child's saying he wants to engage with dad. And to me, this really represents this idea of mattering, which is just a fundamental question that children have and that needs to be answered in these early years is, do I matter to those in my world? And there, if you haven't seen it yet, there's some great resources from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child around mattering. They recently published a really great white paper on this that just highlights just how important this is for children to feel like they matter. And part of what goes into this perception of mattering are these two essential ingredients: feeling valued and feeling like they add value to the relationships in their lives. These feelings of value, both being valued and adding value, come from various building blocks that parents can and caregivers can practice and contribute to children's feelings of mattering. They can help the child feel recognized, that they have people who pay attention to them and recognize what they're doing. They feel attunement. They feel like the caregivers in their lives are not only paying attention to them, but actually also understanding them, reading their cues and their needs, and then responding to those cues and needs in ways that promote healthy development and support. They feel a sense of reliance, like the family needs them, and that they're important as well, that they are an important component of the family. And as children develop over time, there are various ways that this can be recognized. For a slightly older child, it can be that they help out with chores and the parents say, "Thank you, I'm so glad you did that for us." Um, and then finally, the feeling of ego extension, that they're a meaningful part of their relationships. And all these things are just so important for children feeling like they matter. Another essential component of mattering in these responsive interactions is this idea of serve and return, which again, there's some great resources from the Council on the Developing Child for this, and the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. But what we saw in the video clip that we watched was a really beautiful example of this idea of serve and return, which again are really a way of caregivers communicating to children, you matter to me. I want to engage with you, and I think engaging with you is fulfilling, and we can both get something out of it. And so this idea of serve and return is kind of similar to a tennis match, right? A tennis match that's going well and flowing and fun to watch. And we know that these serve and return interactions are essential for shaping children's brain architecture. They're really an important building block for helping children learn on so many different levels and learning that they matter. And so what we saw in the video and what's exemplar of serve and return interactions is that we see this nice back and forth. And we saw that in the video, right? That the child verbalized to the parent looked at the child and responded. And they had this give and take in their interaction where they both took turns back and forth and responded to each other. The parent supports and encourages the child's interest and behavior. So clearly, that child wanted to talk about the TV show they were watching, and the parent recognized that and engaged instead of saying, "Shh, I'm watching. Shh, be quiet right now." There's often a learning component too, that the parent might name what the child is focused on. And so then there's some scaffolding that the child shows interest and the parent builds on that by actually putting words to what the child is focused on and supporting language and cognitive development. And we saw that in the video as well, right? The child didn't yet have the words to say what he wanted to communicate to dad, but he was eager to practice the organization of a conversation, even though he had these placeholders of his baby gibberish. But it worked out beautifully, and it was a really important learning experience for that child. There's a shared focus, a joint attention that helps both parent and child connect with each other and build the relationship, but also helps learning for both members of the dyad. And then it also helps the child learn the routine of different structures in their lives. They're practicing the beginning and ending of a activity or a conversation, and they kind of learn the natural flow of these important rhythms in their family's life. So these serve and return interactions are so critical and a really important part of just children learning their place in their family and the world. And again, these are exemplary of these ideas of responsive parenting, that when we have responsive parents and caregivers, they understand these concepts of how important serve and return interactions are and how important it is to help children feel like they matter and that their needs are valued and should be met. And so we see responsive parents and caregivers recognize and understand their children's cues and developmental needs. They understand what developmentally appropriate expectations are for their children, and they're able and willing to modify their parenting behaviors and strategies based on what they're reading from their child, what they're seeing from their child, and their understanding of their child's current developmental needs and capacities. And we know that responsive parenting benefits virtually all domains of development. So there's a very deep body of research on responsive parenting showing that when parents are responsive and practice responsive parenting practices, that their children have better cognitive and social emotional development. They are more strongly attached to their caregivers and have better self-regulation skills across behavior, attention, and emotion regulation. When we practice responsiveness during feeding interactions, babies have healthier growth and eating behavior development, and it also contributes to better language development. So this is one of the kind of most important things we can support parents in, is helping them to understand this concept of responsive parenting and then understand how to practice it within their own parenting contexts. So now that we've talked about responsive parenting and hopefully have a baseline for understanding how important this is, let's now think about responsive parenting in this digital age and how this idea of technoference might interfere with responsive parenting. So we know that mobile devices have become a fixture in our modern lives. And so the vast majority of adults own a mobile device, and it's widely recognized now that there's not a digital divide that we once saw, a decade ago, that regardless of race, ethnicity, income level, most adults own a mobile device. And even the lower income populations are using their devices more for some of these fundamental activities like banking and kind of life management. So this is a prevalent phenomenon across many social demographic borders. And we use our devices frequently. There's studies that are looking at patterns of device use across a day or multiple days show that we're often checking our devices every 12 minutes or more, and we interact with devices an average of 80 times per day. And I always like to point out too that, distractions are not a new thing. These have always been present in our lives, but this new version of distractions through mobile devices and personal technologies are unique to what we've seen before, because they're not just there and available, but they're actually calling to us, right? We have notifications, we have texts that come through. We have ways that these devices are pulling us in and are designed by very smart people to hold our attention. So we're really facing a new type of distraction nowadays with these personal technologies that really provides a new challenge that we have to think about and overcome. There's research specific to families too, showing that they are similarly engaging with devices at a high level, and especially during parenting moments. So, some of this research has shown that today's parents are spending 4 to 5 hours per day using technology and mobile devices. And I will note that some of this research is self-reported, and we know those data are limited because it is pretty hard to accurately report how much you're using your device, especially texting. Probably if you think about it for your own personal use, it's hard to know, have I texted for 30 minutes today, an hour today, 2 hours today? I don't know, because it's such brief little interactions that you have. But we also have newer methods in our research methodologies where we can actually objectively track device use. And so some of this data is coming from those studies where we're not relying on self-reports, but we're actually able to track on the phone when parents are using it, the timing of their use, what they're doing. And this gives us really more powerful and accurate data around device use. And so we're seeing from this data that parents are spending several hours per day on their devices. They check their smartphones an average of 39 to 67 times per day. And when we specifically look at smartphone use during time with their children, it's about 25 to 30% of the time that they spend with their children, they're also using their smartphones. When we actually asked parents about this too, about their experiences and how they're feeling about their device use, they're not feeling great about it. They often feel distracted by technology when with their children and don't like this feeling, but also feel like it's difficult to rise above it. We've been particularly interested in early feeding interactions because we know that this is a really important parenting context, but it's also a really appealing time for technology use. And so if we think about, especially in the first couple months, that babies are feeding 8 to 12 times per day or more. So this is a context that the parents and babies are just in a lot. And it can be a really tempting time to use a device. And the research that we've done has shown that it is a frequent occurrence for parents of infants. And so in one survey, we asked mothers how frequently they're engaging with technology or tech distractors during infant feeding and care. And overall, a third of mothers often or always engage with tech distractors during infant feeding. The most prevalent at the time of the survey was watching television. There's about 40% who said that they often or always watch TV while feeding their baby, and this was breast or bottle feeding. There's some who are using their computer, and similarly, almost 40% are texting or using apps on their mobile device. And so a concern about this idea of technoference, which is kind of a newer term that's been coined to describe the interference of technology in these interactions, is that it creates this absent presence. The idea that a parent can be physically present in an interaction, but emotionally absent because they're absorbed in their device or distracted by their device or anxious about not using their device. And so instead of being attuned and connected to their child and focused on them and ready to respond to them, there's this interference, this technoference that may be occurring and has a high potential to interfere with responsive parenting. Because, if you remember from what we just talked about with responsive parenting and serve and return interactions and mattering, key components of that are attention, attunement, responsiveness, and all these things. There's a potential for those to be disrupted or delayed when there's a absorptive personal device in the interaction. And so research over the past 15 years has grown and looked at various different parenting contexts and the potential impact of device use on these different parenting contexts. And so I'll give you an overview of some of these different contexts and then dig into feeding in particular and play interactions where we have some compelling evidence to highlight. So some of the early work looking at technoference actually looked at background TV, and I find this research interesting because it's still even though we have all these personal devices that we're using, there's still the potential for background TV in the house, or for parents to be watching a show on their tablet or their phone. And what these studies showed was when you have the background TV, so just a TV on in the background, not child focused programming, but parents are watching TV, that even though it's not directed towards the child, it still affects the child. And so these studies show that when children are playing in the presence of background TV, they have shorter play episodes, less focused attention on their play. And when there's parent-child interaction with background TV, the quality of that interaction is reduced. So it seems to disrupt the baby's or the child's ability to kind of focus on what they're doing, and leads to a lower quality experience during play and interaction. There's also been some research on supervision. So, looking at parents using mobile devices when supervising their children at a pool or on a playground or in the bathtub. There's actually been some experimental work here too. There was a group of researchers who set up a house and put a bunch of kind of dangerous things in it, and saw how well the parents supervised their children in this setting. They had kind of broader safety protocols to make sure nobody got hurt, but I thought it was a very clever design. And across all these different studies, they show that even though parents think that they're supervising their children and that they're prioritizing that over the device use, the actual behavioral measures show that they're less engaged, they have lower visual attention, and they're less ready to respond when the child does something that would be potentially dangerous. There's also been research looking at learning interactions where they've actually tasked the parent to sit down with their child and teach them a new word or a new behavior or about a new toy, and then looked at what happens when that parent is interrupted by a text coming through, or having to, complete something on their phone. So they're trying to juggle teaching something to their child while also being disrupted by a personal technology. And these studies show similarly negative effects on these learning interactions, that there's less joint attention between parent and child, so they connect less during that learning interaction. The parent is a less effective teacher, as we imagine, because they're not as focused on what they're doing and trying to multitask as they're using their device as well. And children don't learn as much, so they don't retain as much from the interaction and don't perform as well during those learning interactions. And then finally, there's been work looking at device use during meals, and if a parent, is at a family meal with their child, but also using their device, what does that do for the quality of the interaction during the meals? And this research shows that there's less engagement, that parents are engaging in fewer conversations with their children. And when their children have bids for their parents' attention, the parents are less responsive to that. They're less responsive to their children's cues. And some of this research even shows that parents who are more absorbed in their phones tend to have harsher responses to their children when they finally do respond. So it does really lower the quality of these mealtime interactions as well. So I want to highlight some work that we've done in this area, specifically looking at technology use during infant feeding, where we did an experimental study and had behavioral measures of both technology use and interaction quality between mothers and babies. And what we did was what's called a within subject experimental conditions, where moms and babies came to visit our lab on 2 different days. And on one day, mom and baby fed in a distraction-free room. There was some really quiet classical music playing, but otherwise no distractions for their feeding interaction. And on the other day, mom was asked to watch a television show on a personal device. And so she had kind of a standardized technology use experience, and then nothing else changed about the feeding. So this really allows us to isolate the potential effects of technology use during the feeding interaction and see how it affects the quality of that interaction. And so we videotaped these interactions and then had students who were trained to do behavioral coding of them, to analyze them. They looked at things like how sensitive was the mom to the baby's cues, how responsive was she, how much social, emotional, and cognitive growth fostering did she do, and how responsive was the baby during the feed interaction. And two of the main things that we found in terms of these maternal inputs into the interaction was that there was a slight reduction in mom's sensitivity to her baby's cues. And so it trended towards significant, but you can see that line is somewhat flat. So it wasn't a huge impact, but we did see less sensitivity to baby's cues when that tech distraction was present. And what was a much stronger finding was that mothers did less cognitive growth fostering when that tech distraction was present. And what this looks like is mainly less talking, that mom was talking to her baby less. The quality of what she said to her baby was lower. There were less complex things that she communicated to her baby. So there weren't as many opportunities for that baby to grow cognitively and learn language and exploration skills from that feeding interaction. Another thing that we did with these videos from this experiment was that we actually coded mom's attention. So we had students, again, who were trained to watch these videos and see where was the mom's attention during the feeding interaction. Was it focused on her baby? Or was it focused elsewhere? Or was it focused on the tablet that we introduced in the experimental condition? And so this is an example from one dyad, but it kind of represents overall what we found. And so what we have here is this is the timeline of the feeding interaction up top in the gray. And then the first block here is the no distraction condition, and the partner is the baby, and then other is looking elsewhere in the room. And then the second block here is the experimental condition where we have the tablet that the mom may be attending to versus her baby versus somewhere else. And so you can see there were just vast and significant differences between mom's attention to her baby. And overall, we found that moms paid significantly less attention to their baby during the distraction condition, and there was less sustained attention. And you can really clearly see that in the visual, that there's just a lot, even though the mom is checking in with her baby and attending, it's very disrupted because she's also checking in with that tablet and watching the TV show. But I do want to point out that we also saw a lot of variability within the sample. So this introduction of technology into the feeding did not affect all moms similarly. And so this is a similar data point, a set of data points that I'm showing you kind of laid out in a similar way. But now we have two different mothers in the technology conditions. So one mother ID A and then the other mother ID B. And now we have the tablet condition is in green in both of these versus attention to the baby is in yellow and other is in blue. And so we can see that IDA spent a lot of time absorbed in that tablet and IDB did not. They were much more focused on their baby despite the presence of that tablet. And I think this is important to point out because it is likely that different moms are more, or different parents are more vulnerable to device use than others. And once we kind of considered attention within our analysis of the quality of the feeding interaction, attention was really what mattered most, more than just the device being present. It was how absorbed the mom got into that device that then predicted less sensitivity to her baby's cues and responsiveness and cognitive growth fostering. So there is that mediating variable, which in my opinion is promising because that gives us something to work with, right? That we know these technologies are ever present, but we can change how we respond to them and hopefully buffer some of the effects they might have on early interactions. I also want to highlight some really creative work that's been done looking at how parent device use might impact infant behavior. And so there have been a series of experimental studies that have taken a classic experimental design called the still face paradigm and put a modern twist on it. So let me explain to you kind of the classic experiments first, and then I'll tell you about the modern twists that tell us a little bit about how parent device use might impact infant behavior. So the traditional still face paradigm was introduced in the 70s as a way of studying maternal depression, postpartum depression, and otherwise low responsiveness to infants. And it's kind of based on the idea that, in infants' biological priming to learn within the context of relationships and to kind of seek these feelings of mattering and responsiveness from parents, they develop these expectations, right? That they will put something out to their caregiver, whether it's a verbalization or a behavior, and hopefully their caregiver will respond to them. And so this still face paradigm disrupts this. And what it does is it's parents of babies are brought into a laboratory setting, and they're asked to engage in these 3 different phases. The first is a face-to-face play episode. So, mom and baby sit face-to-face, and then they just play like they normally would for 2 minutes. Then the experimenter asks the mom to maintain a still face. So to have no emotion, to not respond to her baby, and to just sit there and to hold that for 2 minutes, which I'm always so impressed by the moms and parents who engage in these studies, because that is so hard to just sit there for 2 minutes, not expressing and not responding. But they're able to kind of elicit these behaviors from parents. And so you can imagine, like, that's a socially stressful situation for baby, because it was like, oh, we're having fun, we were playing for 2 minutes, and now all of a sudden my mom's not responding, her face is still, there's no emotion, what's going on here? And this typically does stress babies out. They start to fuss and cry more, they show negative affectivity and less positive affectivity. They might do self-soothing behaviors or try to explore the room to escape. So they typically show that they're stressed through their behaviors. Then there's a reunion phase where mom is instructed by the experimenter to go ahead and kick back in and play with her baby again and calm her baby and help her baby feel better. And this can also show us self-regulation skills in the baby, how well they're able to calm themselves down or be soothed by a caregiver, and whether that's impacted by things like postpartum depression or other caregiving experiences. So this is kind of the traditional, well-known, experimental paradigm that's been looked at to examine effects of parent non-responsiveness. And in the past 5 years or so, researchers have kind of put a tweak on this, thinking that this still face phase is much like what a baby might experience when a parent tunes out on a phone, right? Because they might be face-to-face playing with their baby, and then all of a sudden they get a notification and they pick up their phone and they're absorbed in their phone and focused on that. And the baby might be like, hey, what's up? I thought we were having fun. Why are you now not engaging with me, and what's going on? And so they've used this new version of this experiment to see experimentally and behaviorally, how do babies react when their play interactions with their caregivers are disrupted by mobile devices? And what these studies find is they are indeed reactive to parent mobile device use, that during this phase 2, when the parent-infant play is disrupted by parent mobile device use, that infants increase their levels of negative affect, so they start to cry and fuss and get really upset by this. They decrease their levels of positive affect, so they're doing less smiling and laughing. They kind of decrease their engagement with their mother, so they often have more bids for attention. They try to initially get their mom's attention or their parents' attention away from the device, but when that doesn't work, then they withdraw and disconnect. And some of this work has also looked at moms or parents' typical device use and how it might predict a baby's responses, both in that second phase, the mobile device phase, as well as that reunion phase when babies are trying to recover from this stressful experience and being calmed by their parent. And they also see these associations as well, that when babies have parents who are typically using devices more in their everyday life, that they are less adventurous in that phase 2. They're less likely to explore their room when they're on their own and their parents not there to support them because they're absorbed in a mobile device. And they're also harder to calm down. They have poorer recovery during that reunion phase, the phase 3. So this suggests there may be some kind of lingering impacts of device use on babies' ability to cope with social stressors and recover from negative emotions. And then we also see, using kind of different study designs, that parent tech use, both in the short and the long term, is associated with poorer social emotional outcomes for children. So a lot of this work is focused on mothers, but some is focused on fathers and other caregivers too. And this research has shown that parents who are typically using technology more have babies who have greater negative affectivity. So they're generally more fussy and express more negative emotion, or more sensitive. We see poorer mother to infant attachment, so less connection between mothers and infants. Children show more internalizing and emotion regulation problems. So this would be more like anxiety and withdrawal, and inability to calm themselves down and self-soothe. And also, longitudinal work has shown that greater technology use by parents is associated with increases in externalizing behavior over time, which is represented by things like tantrums and acting out, kind of externalization of emotional difficulties and struggles. So, overall, this is showing that there are definitely connections between device use during important early parenting interactions, and what I highlighted here was feeding and play, and direct impacts of device use on attention, which then may impact the quality of those interactions, and direct impacts of parent device use on children's emotional expressions and perhaps emotional development over time. So now I want to shift a little bit and think about this idea of how device use might intersect with emotions and emotion regulation for both parents and children. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge within this conversation that mobile devices are bringing so much to our lives, right? That we tend to focus on the negative impacts of them, but really they are so important for many families, that they offer a source of social connectedness. They give us quick and easy access to advice and information. The quality of that advice and information may vary if we're not going to reputable sources, but if we know what we're doing and going to good sources, that can be so amazing to be able to access that advice or information at 2 a.m. when your baby has a fever and you don't know how to treat it. And parents report there's been some great qualitative work, that directly asks parents, how are mobile devices fitting in their life? What are they doing for you? What do you worry about? And this qualitative work shows that parents recognize all of these benefits. And also they recognize that these devices really help them cope with a lot of aspects of parenting, especially early on when it may be really hard to leave the house. It is a lifeline, right? It allows parents to connect with others, to calm themselves down, to have a little bit of a distraction when they can't leave because their baby's napping in another room, but they don't know what else to do. And so I think it's really important to honor these benefits and not have parents feel guilty about their device use. Because if we just ask them to stop using their devices, or kind of, have them tuck them away and not pull them out, that would probably be very difficult. They would miss out on a lot of important things. And it's important to acknowledge as well that some of this qualitative work shows that parents are worried too. They feel guilty when they're using their device, but they also feel like it's difficult not to in certain situations, or they might not know how to manage it effectively. And so I think we also don't want to add to that guilt or fuel that guilt, but really recognize that parents need help in understanding how to balance these benefits with the potential detriments that might occur when device use is mistimed or interfering with their responsiveness to their children. And so that's where this idea of media emotion regulation comes from, is that we have really compelling evidence that parents are reaching for their phones to regulate their own emotions. It's become a new tool for us, right? And there's research showing pretty strong associations with parent mental health, that greater smartphone use is consistently associated with higher levels of parent distress and depression. So again, suggesting that these parents who are already struggling with parenthood may be using their devices more because it gives them an outlet, or it gives them support, or allows them to connect in ways that feel good and feel like an escape. We have also shown that mothers who are using their smartphones more feel less connected. They have poor adjustment to motherhood. And this was cross-sectional work that we did. So we don't quite know whether it was the smartphone use disrupting this, or whether it's mothers who are already just not adjusting well, and the smartphone use is helping them cope with that. But in the qualitative work I was referring to, we see that parents are actually telling us, that these phones are really important for helping them to cope with boredom, stress, feelings of disconnection that they may feel in their early parenting moments. And it gives them an easy source of escape, entertainment, and calm. We also see, a lot of variability in use, and we can actually kind of categorize heavy versus light users. And we definitely see certain profiles of heavy users, that they tend to have the worst sleep and the highest depressive symptoms, but they don't always perceive their use as problematic. And so I think those perceptions are really important to understand and acknowledge as well, that just because a parent is using their phone a lot, some may feel like that's problematic, others may not see it as a problem. And that's kind of the starting point for intervention, right? Is how do they feel about their use, and working with parents differently if they're feeling really guilty and like their use is problematic versus if they're feeling like it's just fine. And we'll talk about that in the last section. I think another thing to acknowledge and think about is that it's likely not just a one-way effect here, that parents use their phone and it leads to negative interactions and that's it. But it's much more complicated than that. That these patterns that we see with both parent stress and child behavior, and then with device use, may establish these loops between parent device use and child behavior that self-perpetuate over time. So for example, we see these connections, as I mentioned on the last slide, between parent stress and mood and phone use. And so it may be that a parent who's feeling super stressed is reaching for their device to help them feel better because it's something that fits into their current family life and situation. But by using that device, they're then less attentive to their child, which is causing their child to react and act out in some way. That then is going to contribute to parenting stress, right? And create kind of these loops over time. So it may be that there are already these underlying vulnerabilities, that a child may, have higher levels of negative affectivity initially, or a parent may be more stressed or depressed initially. That phone use is helping the parent cope with that, but then also augmenting and accentuating these issues over time. And so to me, this is a call for early intervention, right? Recognizing these patterns early and hopefully supporting and intervene before they build over time into something that's more difficult for the family to manage. And we also know and have emerging research looking at how these media emotion regulation strategies may spill over to children, right? That again, we have this the compelling evidence that parents are using media to calm themselves down, but then seeing it's a really effective strategy to calm their children. And this is the picture that I have here is a scene that I feel like I've seen so many times, in restaurants and at tables, where the parent is using a device to keep their child calm and quiet so that they'll actually sit down and eat, right? Which on the surface seems like, okay, that child needs to eat. It's getting the job done. And maybe in many other settings, it gives the parent a break so that they can cook dinner, or they can make sure that their child's not acting out in the grocery store or at a restaurant. And so the parents are using screens in many ways to regulate their children's behavior and emotions. But the research shows that this is not necessarily the healthiest soothing strategy. This is some data that we recently published looking at media emotion regulation during the first few months of infancy. And so this was one of the first papers to look at, like, very early on, our parents doing this. And we found that the use of media emotion regulation was fairly low, but actually, higher than I would have thought. That we saw when infants were 2 months old, already 12% of families were using media to regulate their baby's emotions. This raised to 18.5 by 3 months, 21.7 by 4 months, and 23.1 by 5 months. So again, by 5 months of age, almost a quarter of the sample we studied were using media to regulate their baby's emotions and behaviors. The most common use of media emotion regulation was using TV, DVDs, or shows to calm an infant down before bedtime. But we also asked about things like, using a device in a restaurant or a grocery store to keep a baby calm. And we see that these behaviors increase over time as children have greater capacity to hold a device and engage with it, and ask for it. And again, the research shows that even though this may be effective in the moment, and give the parent a break and the child an opportunity to calm down, that over time it's linked with poorer social emotional outcomes for children. That children show greater levels of negative emotionality and greater increases in their negative emotionality during infancy. They show more problematic media use during early childhood, which is represented by things like throwing tantrums when a device is taken away or always asking for it, kind of a compulsion to want to use the device more and more. And we also see that children whose parents use more media emotional regulation with them have poorer self-regulation skills over time. And I do want to point out too that this is similar to what I talked about previously with parents and kind of these patterns and loops that get established, that we see that media emotion regulation is used more frequently in children with more a negative emotionality to begin with. So these children who are maybe more emotionally difficult for their parents may be at higher risk for their parents using media emotion regulation with them. But then it seems like then that perpetuates over time and leads to more issues because it's not the proper support for what they need. So the big question then is, what should we do now that we've kind of talked through the different aspects of this issue? So I'm going to sum up what we've learned so far and then give you some opportunities to reflect on what we can do and how we can support parents within this domain. So as we've talked about, one of the most important things that we can do for young children is help them feel like they matter. And we know that responsive and serve and return interactions are the best way to do this and to build healthy brain architecture. We also know that today's parents have a unique struggle that, parents have always been distracted in many ways, but these digital devices are just so deeply embedded in our family life. And we see that within the data that parents are spending several hours per day on devices. And even when they're around their children, over a quarter of that time, they're on devices. And we have research that suggests that technoference is real, that creates this absent presence that reduces parents' attention and disrupts their responsiveness to their children, especially during some of these really important contexts like feeding and play. And research also shows negative impacts on children's behavior, that children notice when their parents use device and they react negatively and in a way that doesn't support healthy social emotional development. We also can recognize these loops that may occur, that there are certain parents and children who may be more vulnerable to both phone use or device use, as well as the negative effects of technoference. And so hopefully by observing and catching these loops early, we can provide the supports that families need to mitigate negative effects and balance device use with children's needs for responsive parents. And we've also talked about media emotion regulations and how both parents may be using it with themselves, but also with their children. But the research that we have so far is showing that it's linked to poorer child outcomes, especially within the realm of emotion regulation. So I'm going to talk about 4 different recommendations of how we can consider this research and then think about how to support families. And so I've got the list here, but I'll go into each one of these bullets in more detail. So my 4 suggestions for you are to first address device use in your practice. Make sure it's part of your curriculum or your talking points, or the things that you do with families to provide them that acknowledgement and education. I also recommend understanding links between technology use and mental health, recognizing that context, content, and intent matter, and helping parents find balance while reducing their feelings of guilt. So Parents report that this is often not talked about when they interact with practitioners and caregivers. And I think, part of that is because it's a very new phenomenon, but there are some great resources out there. I have one that I'll highlight in a little bit. But the American Academy of Pediatrics has information on family device use and a family media plan. So there is guidance for practitioners that then can be passed on to parents. And so the first step is talking about it. But the research shows that, mothers report no health professionals talk to them about their smartphone use while caregiving. And paradoxically, we often rely on these app-based or device-based resources, right? Which again is great that we have these, but if the only message you're receiving is use this app or track this in this way, then that may be a paradoxical message. And so this is really a missed public health opportunity to not just, broach the conversation and talk about it, especially because the research shows that parents want these conversations. They want direction and advice from people that they trust. I also want to emphasize these links between technology use and mental health. And, the solution is not just to tell parents not to do it or not to use their devices. By doing that, you may make them feel guilty about something that's a crutch for them, right? It's really helping them through parenting. And so by understanding that problematic media use may be driven by depression, parenting stress, or work family conflicts, we can hopefully then address the real issue, which may not be the device use, but maybe the struggle that that parent is having that they need support for. And I know that you're here because you appreciate that when adults feel they matter, then they have the bandwidth to make children feel they matter. And I always, love the idea that every parent is doing the best they can with the resources they have, right? So no parent doesn't want to do the best for their child, but they don't always have all the skills and resources they need to follow through on our recommendations. So by kind of probing a little deeper and really understanding the device use, the source of it, and what's going maybe on at a deeper level, we can hopefully give parents the intervention they need to support them to support their children. And then I think we're just starting to better consider and study these important factors of context, content, and intent. So our early research has really just looked at use, right? Like how much are parents using and when are they using their devices? But we're better kind of understanding that not all use is the same and not all technology use disrupts relationship. And again, I'll come back to my initial video where we had dad and baby in front of a TV. Dan had his phone open on his lap, yet he was so attuned and attentive to his baby, and they had such a fun and engaging conversation. And so that dad was so effectively using technology as a tool to connect with his baby. And it was a beautiful interaction. So it's important to recognize this as well and to kind of probe it a little bit deeper, that research shows that just because a parent is checking or using their phone, they're not necessarily less warm. And again, in the research that I presented from my lab, not all moms got absorbed in a device as soon as we gave it to them. Some were really resilient and still really attentive to their baby. So we have to kind of understand how we can preserve and promote that with the parents that we work with. Recent data we published also showed that mothers who feel more empowered by their smartphone use actually engage in higher quality interactions with their infants. They may be using their smartphones in ways that help them better understand their baby and how to be an effective parent. And so that means that it's a really powerful tool for them that hopefully we can, help with the nuances of when and how they're using it, but help them understand how to use their device in a way that supports healthy parenting. And there's also great research showing that a device by itself is not that helpful to children for their learning and development, but a device used with an adult can be. And so, thinking thoughtfully about educational co-use media where parents and the child are using it together is linked to better social, emotional, and cognitive outcomes. And finally, we really want to work with parents to help them find balance while reducing guilt. I think we can all appreciate we don't want to give parents another reason to feel guilty about what they're doing. And we know from some of the research I presented that they already often do when it comes to technology use. So some of the things you can think about incorporating into your practice with parents is helping them understand how to maximize the benefits of technology, but being mindful about when they're using it. And there's probably many times when it would be just fine for them to use their technology, like when their child is asleep or engaged in other activities or with others. Or I always think about, with feeding, we really want the caregiver to be attentive and attuned to their child. But the reality is there are many times when infants are just eyes closed, they're just really into the feeding. They're not wanting to engage with their parent. And that might be an okay time to check a text or email, just making sure that you're frequently checking back in with that baby to make sure that they're still in that state versus have changed and are ready to interact. And so really, with this, I think it's trying to come back to that principle of responsive parenting, where you're taking the lead of your child. You're watching your child's cues. And when they're telling you, I want to engage, you engage. And when they're telling you, I need a break, that's when you can take a break too. We also want parents to just be aware of this research too, that even though they might be able to time their technology use by watching their child or thinking about their child's where their child is and what their child is doing, there still is that kind of risk that using technology during feeding and other interactions is going to decrease their ability to catch those subtle cues. And we know subtle cues are important precursors to children communicating their needs. So even if a parent does choose to use technology during these interactions, they should have mechanisms in place to take frequent breaks, to have frequent check-ins, to make sure they're still able to be responsive to their child. And as we've already talked about, helping parents understand that as their child grows, they can use technology sparingly as an opportunity to check in and not check out. And I think one additional consideration that I didn't put on the slide, but is something that you can work with families about, is just thinking about like the daily family rhythms too, and whether there might be certain aspects of that they can protect and hold sacred. Meal times, bedtimes, these might be times where you want to say, this is a technology-free zone. We just connect during these times because this is important to our family. And then maybe some of these other times it's okay. We'll use it together and enjoy it. So having the family think through their rhythms and values, and knowing that there are these certain sensitive times like feeding, meal times, bedtimes, where it's probably best to leave technology out and save it for other times. I also wanted to point you to a great resource if you haven't seen this yet. The Children and Screens Institute of Digital Media and Child Development funded some of the research that I presented today. And they're just a fantastic organization that has done a lot to educate and fund research and really communicate directly to families and practitioners about these issues around family technology use. And they have a lot of great, they have a podcast and additional videos and handouts that you can use with families. So if you're interested in learning more or to looking at more resources that you can share with the families that you work with, this is a great place to start and to follow their work. And I'll just end with where I started, that we know that every caregiving moment is a chance to say, yes, you matter to me. And I think holding that like at the foundation of your work with families is a great guide for then thinking about how to guide them with their device use, and helping parents understand just how important these interactions are for shaping children's views of the world. Will hopefully help them appreciate that that's more valuable than using their device or their phone in the moment. And then hopefully with additional support and skills built by you, they can enact some of these principles to help preserve these mattering moments. So thank you so much. I'll welcome any questions, but if you'd like to reach out or learn more about our work, I have my contact information for you here too. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ventura. We want to give us a hand. We can do in our reactions. I see some hearts coming up, some hands. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful presentation, full of information, and certainly a lot of questions jumped up in my mind as you were presenting. A lot of good information. And the video that you shared, I played that so many times. It's so cute, and it just reminds us of how it does matter the time that you spend with your children and the time that we spend with each other, of course. So as I said at the beginning, we have some questions that came in through registration. So we'll start with those, and I see also we have some on the Q&A that we'll get to as well. So the first question is for professionals working directly with families, what are the most important signs that digital media use may be affecting caregiver-child interactions, and how can those conversations be introduced in a constructive way? That's the first part. And how can we reframe these conversations to be focused on strengthening caregiving and family relationships?
Yeah. So I would venture to guess that this is obvious, often quite obvious to practitioners that, if we observe in the settings that we're seeing families, we're often seeing that device use is happening in waiting rooms or in clinical settings, right? That the families are not always hiding this away in their home, but it's something that they're frequently doing out in public because they're using it to fill the time or to keep their child calm. And so that would be the first sign, right? If you're seeing that this is happening in the environments that you're engaging with families, then it might be an opportunity to gently broach the topic and provide some education if the family feels receptive to it. There are also, screeners or questions that could be asked around how devices are being used in the home. There are, as I mentioned in my talk about implications, kind of these like higher risk settings, right? So even I think asking about, does your family watch TV while they eat? Does your child have a TV in their room? Or are you using devices at the table or in the room? That might be a easy like initial question that would indicate that, yeah, devices are kind of infused in these important parenting moments. And would be an opportunity then to provide some targeted education and intervention. And again, I think the messages can be crafted based on the recommendations I provided and some of the resources I provided. I would again direct the audience to both the Children and Screens resources as well as the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations, and really, addressing it from the standpoint of what your child needs from you, which is responsiveness, attention, attunement to their cues, and helping parents recognize that even if you feel like your device isn't interfering, it might be causing you to miss out on these subtle cues that your child is giving you. And I also would speculate that parents might be pretty motivated about the idea that these patterns of device use might lead to more problems over time, right? But that knowing that if they're using media to regulate their child's emotions, and that's actually going to lead to more problematic behaviors in the long run, that might help them, be less motivated to use devices. But we, of course, have to give them alternative strategies too, not just don't do that, but rather this would be more effective, getting down on your knees and giving your child a hug when they're stressed out rather than handing them device. Having those replacement strategies will probably go a long way in behavior change.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think the second, and I think as you were talking about this, it just reminded me that how do we as a community start to practice these things, right? So wherever we're going, we can see that we're working together to wean ourselves off, to be more responsive. And so there's that opportunity to be a community of practice of lessening screen time and being more responsive.
Yeah.
So our second question is, what practical strategies can organizations incorporate into existing family support programs, such as you started to say, such as home visiting, pediatric care, and parenting education to promote healthier digital habits without adding burdens to the families?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, even just in those settings, modeling the behavior, like you just alluded to, Wendy, that having those settings be screen-free zones gives an initial message of like, we value you, we want to focus on you, we want you to get everything you can out of this. So let's all tuck our phones away and turn it off and just really be together. And I think even though it's super subtle, it is a nice modeling moment and message to families. And then, as I mentioned in my talk, I think just having the conversation is an important first step because that conversation is often not happening. So broaching the topic and and gauging the parents' feelings about it and need for support, and then being able to tailor that support accordingly, whether they need to kind of recognize how to set up their home environment so there's less temptation, or setting up these special zones. That there are a lot of simple strategies that wouldn't take a lot on the part of the parent and wouldn't make them feel like I can't do this anymore and I can't, balance work and life and everything else. But rather I can be more mindful and use the tools and resources available to me to do that.
Yeah, and give ourselves a little grace because it
Yeah.
took us a long time to get here, right? And it's going to take a bit
Yes.
to to reduce it. So our next question, thank you for that, Dr. Ventura. What
Mhm.
role should system leaders and policymakers play in addressing digital well-being as a part of the broader child development efforts? And where do you see the greatest opportunity for impact?
Yeah. Well, I've been really heartened by what we've been seeing in the news lately around regulation, right? I know a lot of this pertains to older children and the risks that they face through device use and social media. And I think that's such an important step because these device makers and app makers, they're a Goliath, right? Like they've become so powerful. And there needs to be some regulation to protect parents and children, on so many different levels. And so I think contributing to those efforts is really important. Um, just to make sure that there are protections in place in what has been a largely unregulated setting. That the incoming of AI is another real concern, and I think we also need to think about how we can protect parents against misinformation, through their device use and AI use, and make sure that we're understanding where they're getting their information from, and then having effective strategies for countering that, or re-educating, or guiding them to better sources. And I would say maybe beyond that too, also just kind of better policy and regulation around device use and the settings that it's accepted and used in versus not. Um, Certainly early childhood education environments would be a great one for this sort of regulation, because I know the caregivers in those settings have their own stresses and needs and whatnot, but that could definitely be a device-free zone, right? And you use it on your breaks, and I'm sure many of those settings already have that, but there are probably certain settings where we can just make sure that like devices have no place here. We're very focused on our children, and then we're going to balance it in other places as needed.
Yeah, and using it as a value. We come in and
Yeah,
when we search for childcare places or places where we're
yeah,
placing our children, we look at the values, we look at what they're doing. And so that certainly can be a part of that as again, as we're moving as a matter of community practice. So exactly it's how we're going to work together, through the systems, in the systems, and how do we change the systems, right?
yeah.
And then the last of our registered questions was if you could recommend one immediate action for professionals or organizations to take after today's webinar, what would it be and why?
Hmm. So I would kind of evaluate, your curriculum or what you're doing with parents, and see if you aren't already addressing this, where is the place for it? Where can we add a little lesson or a module or an assessment where we can actually address this with parents? And maybe if you're already talking about children's screen time, that would be a natural pairing of like, do you know that like uh, we don't only want to talk about this relative to your child, but let's talk about you too and how
Mm.
you're using it. And so thinking about where it could fit in with what you do. And then I think we have, there's some great resources out there to draw from between the American Academy of Pediatrics, Children's and Screens, and many others, to then think about what's the message that most aligns with our values and our mission as an organization, but would also be really helpful to the parents that we work with.
I appreciate that. I had the privilege to attend the pediatric town hall in San Luis Obispo
Mhm.
yesterday. It was a full room on a Wednesday night, so it was interesting. So this is something that's really on the hearts of folks, even in the community, certainly in the professions that are doing this. And so, what can we do? And I think our last speaker was talking just keep going and keep working and continue to do this work because it's so very important. So I appreciate what you're saying, what we can do, and why we need to do it. So with that, I want us to turn to our Q&A questions that came up during the presentation. I think we have 3, maybe a couple more. The first was much of the presented research, not only your amazing work, seems to be from before the pandemic. Do you have any thoughts on how much worse the technofriends, yes, might be now? It seems likely that there has been a significant increase in device usage, especially as we learn more about how addictive, different forms of technology can be on us.
Yeah, definitely. And well, I would say like the research in this field has really exploded, since the pandemic. So I think that is a sign of what the participant is asking here, that it was a slippery slope for many of us, right? That all of a sudden our children had devices that they had to be on, and we're now so comfortable with being on our devices all the time that it really changed the architecture of our family lives in a way that stuck. And so I would say that yes, it has I guess augmented since the pandemic, that we have data showing that, and that the parents are using devices even more. But I would say it's also like just the trends in technology development too, right? That these devices are continually becoming cheaper. And as I mentioned, with the advent of AI now too, we can get tailored answers to any question that we have, whether or not it's a good answer. Sounds like it, but we don't know. So it is like a combination of powerful factors, and I think the takeaway to remember is that it's an avalanche, right? It's not stopping anytime soon. So it definitely means we have to keep studying and thinking and understanding and having the conversations with families to understand how their use is, because how they're using technology today is going to be different in 6 months. So if we're not asking the questions and understanding, we're not going to be giving families the best support.
Thank you. So next question. In the still face students, what is the typical age range of the infants? Studies, not students, studies.
Yeah, participants. It's infants. So I think the still face is often done in like mid infancy, but it's been done with infants 2 to 14, 18 months. So in the mobile device studies in particular, it was infants within the first 18 months.
I see my friend Wendy went here. We're the Wendy's in
Hi, Wendy.
Our question, is there research on who, what, how are the most trusted messengers, guides, approaches for supporting parents to develop healthy tech use habits in the context of parenting and bonding?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know of any research that's looked at the most effective messengers. I can speak more broadly that parents are usually very trusting of their pediatricians, right? That they're often the most effective messengers for parenting and health advice. Um, so I wouldn't be surprised if that would follow suit for tech use as well. But I don't know of any research that specifically looked at that. So that would be a great study to do.
So you hear that, Wendy. So that might be one of the things we want to work on. And then I have from Ms. Cara Garcia. Thank you for this presentation. I would argue that the digital divide is still present, but different. We see many families whose parents work a lot, whose kids stay on screens all summer long. It is so concerning. I worry for low-income families, as many of their children have unlimited screen time. Also, more highly educated families know the risk and will learn them much sooner than others. I'm glad our home visitors are learning about this, and I hope our promoters the spread the info fast. So there's more like a comment there.
Yeah, and I'll just reflect. I'm so thankful for that comment. When I was talking about the digital divide, was really thinking about the parents, right, and whether or not they'd have a device or not, and the fact that most parents do nowadays, regardless of their income level. But I think that's such an important point, that there is a lot of socioeconomic status related differences in how devices are managed within the home, and whether there are limits, or whether it might, for these families who don't have daycare or otherwise, that might be a really important need that it's filling, even if it doesn't it's not ideal. So I appreciate that comment.
Yeah, and Brianna, I see you might want to answer that question. Is that still there? She coming off? Okay.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just clearing it, Wendy.
Oh, you're just clearing.
Yes.
Okay, I was just trying to make sure. Wait a minute, she came in and she went off. So, so is I'm looking at the Q and A. Is that was that the last question that was coming through? Are you guys that are also looking at it?
We have one more on here on the Q&A, Wendy. It says, how can parents and caregivers model responsible technology use while also promoting technological literacy?
That's a great question. So I think, the modeling comes from the mindfulness, right, of making sure that technology use is binned into certain times when it would be more appropriate and less interfering with family interaction. So, modeling that we don't use our devices at the table because we want to be together during the meal. We don't use it when we're in a conversation. And parents can also model the repair too, right? That we're not perfect. So it might be that we get a call or a text when we're playing a game with our child that we really need to answer. And so we do it, but then afterwards we say, I'm so sorry. That probably didn't feel good to you. I really needed to get that work call, but I'm focused on you now and let's get back into it, right? So just like we would with other aspects of parenting, making sure that we're communicating that to our children of like, you are very important to me, but sometimes I do need to respond to work items or family items or that sort of thing with technology. And then, yeah, I agree. Like it's just not feasible to have screen-free homes these days. That we recognize that might actually not serve our children well for the future because it's very likely that they're going to need to be proficient in technology to be successful in their future careers or even in their more immediate school settings. But the co-use is probably the best way to help that, right? That make sure that we are waiting until children are over 18 months to really introduce them to the personal use of technology. And even after that, using it sparingly. But then when it is used, it's parent and child together, parents showing child, this is how we use this and let's use this together and let's enjoy this together. So that children have these kind of safe scaffolded experiences with technology that help them learn the benefits, but also really strong modeling that help them learn the limits.
Okay, next question. Do you have any recommendations about how to address children's screen time use, especially as it relates to use in schools? It is a hot topic in the moms groups these days.
I
I
know.
can certainly attest to that. I sat on the school board when we were doing COVID, so we definitely had that. So yes, that's a
Yeah.
good question.
Yeah, definitely. Um, well, there are recommendations around screen time. So if that has been helpful in your previous practice, that could be a starting place. Of the American Academy of Pediatrics has like very specific guidelines around the certain ages when certain things can be introduced and daily limits. So those can be again communicated to parents, and parents can be supported in thinking through like how can I implement these in my family structure. Um, and pairing that discussion of recommendations with discussion around the cognitive and emotional effects and kind of all of the things that may happen when children are on screens too much or rely on screens for emotion regulation. um, and then, yeah, the question around schools is tricky, especially because I feel like there's variability too. That right, some schools maybe have stronger restrictions against technology use, and others are using it quite a lot in their classrooms. But I think kind of understanding what's going on and how it's being used is a good place to start, and then having conversations with school administrators for areas of concern. Um, Especially with things like these apps that children are put on to like drill their math skills. And it's like, this is really helpful. Or is it just giving the teacher a break? So there may be opportunities to just kind of better understand what's going on in a particular school, and how to work with administrators to express concern around what it might be doing for the children's learning and development.
Yes, I would add that again, as it's sitting on the school board, assuming when we're coming back into in-person learning, that certainly was a huge concern. So we had a mom's group, as a matter of fact, that came and advocated before the board and really gave recommendations. So now schools are really have technology policies and procedures. So get to know what that may be and to figure out what that is and how you can strengthen that, or maybe that is not necessarily being let. So there's another opportunity, as you're saying here, to speak with the administrator, ask if they do have a policy and procedure and to you can look at it and respond to as well. So I would agree with what you're saying there.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question: what would you recommend with families who live far away to keep engaged with their child, keeping healthy screen times in mind, like FaceTime and pictures? So
Oh, okay. Yeah, the research shows that, FaceTime, and I think even the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations, that's kind of an exception. That they say no screen use for children 0 to 18 months, except FaceTime with family members, because it's recognized that is actually really beneficial, a beneficial use of technology to be able to connect with family far away. So I think, families can be informed of like, yeah, keep doing this. Like, it is really important for your child to have a deep relationship with their grandparents or their aunts and uncles or whoever who they can't like physically connect with in person, but they can still have a great emotional connection with through FaceTime. So that would be a great co-use that would, I think, be really, really beneficial for child's development.
okay, I appreciate that too, because we have families who are not able to live around the street with their grandparents. So that is that obviously that's that positive side of the technology that we can use.
Sure.
Are there differences in the research on screen time when it comes to playing on tablets and apps versus just watching TV, positive or negative for either when helping families figure out ways to set limits or incorporate screens?
Yeah, this is another area where, content, context, and intent matter, right? That, like, if you think about the array of media available to children, like when I was a child, and probably many of you remember this, like the shows we watched were slow, right? That there was like a plot and conversation, and it just kind of moved at a slower pace. But research has shown that like modern, even shows like are fast. They're fast paced. There's a lot of bling coming at you. It's just like kind of high stimulation and high attention switching. Which is less desirable for children for sure, because it kind of sets them up into this like high arousal state, and they gain less from the programming. So I think that would be like kind of the first distinction to make and to think about. And we often do this with our kids too, of like, you can sit down and watch a show, but it's got to have a plot. And here's a selection of shows that we would recommend that you pick from, because we know it's got positive messages and people are being kind to each other, and it's actually got a storyline that our kids can follow and learn from. So quality definitely matters there. And I would say the same for apps. There's definitely some apps where it's just like stimulation coming at you right and left, and you're just tapping, or it's like kind of high like dopamine stimulus. And so maybe like veering away from those and leaning more into these educational apps that are helping children learn numbers and letters and words. There's definitely varying quality, and I would say with anything like, for a parent, sit down and do it with your child or watch it with your child at least a couple times. And then maybe not every time if you feel like you really need that break to cook dinner and you want them to be busy. But like I feel like personally, like my partner and I have learned so much, but just by sitting down with our children and being like, show me this, show me what you're doing. And, sometimes after seeing that, we're like, okay, go for it. And other times we're like, let's maybe not like use this one. So I think being an informed parent is really important too. So then you can guide your children to make mindful decisions about what they're consuming.
I appreciate that. And it looks like there's no additional questions in the Q&A. Thank you for those who submitted the questions ahead of time and also who were doing this presentation. Dr. Ventura, this has been an absolute wonderful time spent with you today. I can tell by the love, the hearts coming up. So if we want to get our hand reactions in there, getting up there as well.
Everybody.
Did you see the screen magic when I went below and then I came back up? See, so, screens. So, we always have a little humor and always an opportunity to come. It opened up so many questions, and I'm sure this is very engaging. How do we then take what we learned today from you and had in conversation with you today, we take it out and apply it somewhere. It's always important to apply what we're learning and at least engage in another conversation. So I personally appreciate today and the opportunity to be in conversation with you today. And I believe that concludes us, but I want to make sure that I'm following where Lexi and Brianna are taking us for the day.
Oh, you're muted, Lexi.
Thank you both. Yeah, technology here today, right? But thank you both for just kind of answering all of our questions. And Dr. Allison, it was such an engaging talk, and we really appreciate your time with us. We'll be sending out some info via email just about the recording and other surveys and things like that. So thank you, everyone. And yes, this concludes our 2026 Ed Talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. This was so fun. I really appreciate all the questions and engagement. So thanks for the opportunity.